Hello again. In this video, I want to talk about Shitty First Drafts by Lamott, the essay I'd given you to read, I think for last week. So I apologize for not getting this video to you before our rough draft was due necessarily, but hopefully you got a chance to read it and maybe get some of the insights before you submitted it. So the first thing I'll say is that I think the problem with the way rough drafting is taught generally, and what I hear from students when I talk to them about it is I just really don't think that students really and teachers, I think it's the fault of a lot of teachers, don't really explain like why we're doing the rough draft enough, you know? Like a lot of students will tell me that they'll write a rough draft, and for a lot of their classes the rough draft had to be like the same number of pages as the final version, that it would be graded but like by the same standards as the final version. So like if you wrote a rough draft and the grammar was wrong or something, you would get like a B plus or worse than that, like a C on your rough draft, or like your conclusion wasn't done correctly on the rough draft, so now you're losing points. That just never made sense to me, and I think it doesn't make sense to most of you guys. It makes you feel like you're writing the paper twice. You do the rough draft and then you're like, why would I do it again? I already did this. It's like I'm done already. Why would I do it again? And the teachers would insist that you change something, so then you look for like 5 words that you can just change out with a different word. And the whole revision process just ends up feeling very unnecessary and silly. So I think that the key with rough drafts is to see it not as like a standalone assignment or like an assignment in and of itself, but as like something that's going to help you get to a better essay at the end of the day, more as like a stepping stone to get to your best essay when it's actually due. So that's why I think I mentioned this in a previous video. But for our rough draft, I don't need it to be in this case for the narrative essay. It would have to be the narrative essay is 3 pages, right? I don't need 3 pages for the rough draft. I think 1 page, 1.5, 2 pages, I think would probably be ideal, but maybe 1 or 1.5 is fine. I can work with that. Mostly, if I can just see what your idea is, what the stories you're going to use, what the message is going to be, that kind of stuff, then I can at least give feedback. And I just feel like it's a lot more helpful to kind of get feedback at that point where you're like maybe halfway through, maybe 3/4 of the way through. So then you can get feedback to see like if what you've done so far is going in the right direction, but then also so you can figure out like how to finish it off and get the best final version. So I always view the rough drafts as incomplete works. That's how they should be viewed. So I always grade them on completeness, right? As long as you have like a decent amount, as long as you have a couple paragraphs or a page or something, you hand it on time, you meet the requirements and everything, you get all the points. So I always grade them on completion, because then I think that it makes us see it as working towards the final version. So I want to talk about shitty first drafts now, and I think that's why she gives it this title, right? The title of this essay always sticks out. And it's just the idea of like, why would the rough draft be good? Like we call it rough, number one. Even if you're calling it a first draft, it's still the first one. So it's like, why would it be good? Why would it be perfect? Why would it be to the point where you could, grade it based on the grammar or the conclusion or stuff like that? Um, so, and I think that the problem, I think a lot of people have trouble kind of getting like yeah, in my other video I was responding to a question that someone said they were having trouble just getting started with the essay, and I think part of the problem is that we put so much pressure on ourselves to like write it perfectly the first time, and that just makes it really hard to even say anything. Like it's so much pressure you can't even say a single word. It's like, oh well, that wasn't perfect, what if that's not good enough? So I think the shitty first draft approach really allows us to just kind of get our ideas on the page, and not worry too much about it, and then ideally we have a couple of days. We're not doing this the night before it's due, so then we can get our ideas on the page and then come back to it another time and then kind of see what makes sense and what doesn't. um, so she starts off here by addressing some like misconceptions about draft. Like I feel like a lot of students think that they just think that they're bad at writing. They just think they suck at writing, and that's why they can't just write it perfectly immediately. So she says here, people tend to look at successful writers who are getting their books published and maybe even doing well financially and think that they sit down at their desks every morning feeling like $1 million, feeling great about who they are and how much talent they have and what a great story they have to tell. That they take in a few deep breaths, push their sleeves back, roll their necks a few times to get all the cricks out, and dive in typing fully formed passages as fast as a court reporter. But this is just the fantasy of the uninitiated. So yeah, I think she's right that we assume that the reason we can't just like the words don't just come easily and naturally to us in a perfect way with perfect grammar is because we're not good at this. But what she's telling us here is that actually no one really writes that way. Later on, she says, we all often feel like we are pulling teeth, even those writers whose prose ends up being the most natural and fluid. So I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but I think what she's telling us here, and she's an author, so she could say, but in my experience, this is true as well, is that writing is kind of this painful thing for everyone, that like everyone does get writer's block at certain times, and that everyone does need to write drafts. That even people who are really good writers, it's not just that they sit there and they just think of the essay totally in order and just write it through once and then it's done in a couple hours. It's just not like that. And I think you could view this as bad news because that means that there's no like secret trick or this one weird trick to get your essays done perfectly very fast. There's no secret trick to learn in that kind of way, and as a writing teacher, there's not any magical key I can give. But on the other hand, it's kind of good news because it means that the fact that writing has been a painful experience for you before, the fact that if you don't feel like the perfect words are always just coming to you automatically, that actually means that you're just kind of normal. That actually means that you're human, and that's how it is for everybody. It reminds me of like when I was a kid and I would watch like my parents drive a car, and I always thought they must have some kind of like secret knowledge, like some kind of deep, vast technical knowledge of how the car worked and be able to read the gauges. And I basically thought of it the way you'd think of like someone flying a plane. Um, and I always wondered like how they could keep their eyes open when the headlights were coming in the opposite direction because I would always close my eyes as a kid. And then when you grow up and if you start driving, you realize that like no one knows what they're doing, that like everyone's just bullshitting it. And I kind of think that's how it is with writing, where you look at people who are doing it, or people who get good grades on their essays, or people who write, and you think like, oh, they must have some secret knowledge I don't, and the fact is no, they just maybe have a more developed writing process, right? We've been talking a lot about the writing process, this whole idea of having these different steps to get to our best essay. Yeah, so she goes on to say, for me and most of the writers I know, writing is not rapturous. In fact, the only way I can get anything written at all is to write really, really shitty first drafts. And I think this makes a lot of sense. If you guys have heard of like free writing before, it's kind of this idea of just writing without really thinking about it, without like editing or censoring yourself or worrying like, oh, is this the right word? Is this the right vocabulary? Or like, am I putting the comma in the right place or whatever? It's just kind of going directly from thoughts like to page. And I think that that is a really great way to get started with an essay. Obviously, depending on the topic you're writing about, for our narrative essay, maybe your whatever the story is that you're going to write, just think about the way you tell the story to someone. Think about the way you tell the story to a friend, and maybe just start typing that up, and then you can go back later and try to move things around. But I just always think that's better than having a blank page. So other things in this essay, she gives us some insight into her own writing process, where I think she's talking about writing like a food magazine. Um, she says, yeah, she would sit down to write the review, and she writes, even after I'd been doing this for years, panic would set in. I'd try to write a lead. Instead, I'd write a couple of dreadful sentences, X them out, try again, X everything out, and then to feel despair and worry settle on my chest like an X-ray apron. It's over, I think. I'm not going to be able to get the magic to work this time. I'm ruined. I'm through. I'm toast. She goes on, I'd go back and sit down at my desk and sigh for the next 10 minutes. Eventually, I would pick up my 1-inch picture frame, stare into it as if for an answer, and every time the answer would come, all I had to do was write a really shitty first draft of, say, the opening paragraph. And then she goes on, so I'd start writing without reining myself in. It was almost just typing, just making my fingers move, and the writing would be terrible. um, so yeah, I think that's kind of the process where it's like, I understand that like that the writing assignment can seem so daunting, and you're like, how am I going to write 3 pages, and how am I going to write something that's that long, and I don't even know where to start. So when you're feeling overwhelmed by that kind of thing, less important than where you start is just that you get started. So if you're like, okay, I don't really know what the beginning is going to be about, I don't know what my introduction is going to be, but there's one thing in the middle I know I'm going to say, just get that on the page. Once it's on the page, you can add to it, you can move it, you can put things before it, and then it starts to take shape and you get moving. She says later on, I've been writing so long, I would eventually let myself trust the process. So she talks about how this is how it is every time, that every time she has to write something, it's this kind of existentially dread kind of experience, that it becomes it's very psychological, like so quickly you go from like, okay, I'm going to write this essay. I know what I'm doing. You're looking at the blank page, and then you're like, well, why does anyone do anything? Why does anyone ever write a thing? Why does anyone even get out of bed in the morning? And like it just becomes very existential, like very quickly. And yeah, again, unfortunately, that's just how it is. That's normal. That's just the experience that everyone has. And for Anne Lamott, and I don't know, try this out, maybe for you too. She says if you just start getting something on the page, it gets everything else going. That if you take off the pressure, don't worry about it being perfect the first time. Just write a shitty first draft. Just get some of your ideas on there. Then you can kind of go from there. So just to wrap up, right. So yeah, the second to last paragraph, she says, a month later, when it came time for another review, the whole process would start again, complete with the fears. So yeah, that's the idea of the writing process. Is that it doesn't make it easy. It's not painless, but it's steps that you can go through where eventually you do get the thing written. I think that's what we're interested in here. So the last paragraph, I'll just read some. She says, almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting anything down on paper. A friend of mine says the first draft is the down draft. You just get it down. The second draft is the up draft. You fix it up. You try to say what you have to say more accurately. The third draft is the dental draft, where you check every tooth to see if it's loose or camped or decayed or even, God help us, healthy. So there you go. That's the approach that I would encourage you guys to take for drafting in any class, but definitely in this class. That's how I want you guys to approach it. For the first draft, it doesn't have to be that long. Just get your ideas on the page. Let your mind kind of go where it wants to go. Don't worry if you have a paragraph that's half finished. Don't worry if you don't have a conclusion. Don't worry if there's no intro. Whatever. Just write what you were able to write at this point, and then I can look at it and just give you some ideas, give you some suggestions, ask some questions, whatever I think is going to help you. All right, so that's it for now. More videos coming later.